The soldiers arrived in silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that speaks of peace or contemplation. No, this was a hollow, unsettling stillness, the kind of quiet that seeps in when trauma is too vast to voice. They had been through hell, seen the horrors of war so vividly that it had pierced through their minds, leaving jagged fragments of terror. But no one spoke of it. No one knew how to. The medical staff, busy with wounds and blood, had no words for what these men were experiencing. Their bodies were physically intact, but something deeper had been broken. Eyes that once sparkled with life now seemed distant, hollow. Their movements were slow, like they were trudging through invisible mud, dragging the weight of their own minds. The veterans didn't speak of the nightmares they'd had or the uncontrollable tremors that gripped their hands. They didn't talk about the suffocating feeling of being trapped in their own skin, and so they remained mute, misunderstood, invisible in a world that had no place for their pain. There was no diagnosis, no treatment, just the quiet, creeping sense that something was terribly wrong. The soldiers filed in, one by one, into the wards, their faces telling stories their mouths would never utter. The doctors looked at them with a sense of uncertainty, unsure of what they were dealing with. No name for it, no understanding of it. At the time, it was just a mystery, a puzzle that seemed too complex to solve. Perhaps it was their own fault, some whispered. Perhaps they were weak. No one knew how to treat this unseen wound, and so it festered, untreated, unspoken. The soldiers looked to the doctors for help, but the help never came. They would lie in the beds, their eyes glazed over, staring at nothing in particular, trying to hold on to their sanity, to their humanity, in a world that had forgotten them. The moment shell shock began to reveal itself as a true crisis was subtle, a gradual shift in the air. A few doctors, more observant than others, began to take note of the increasing number of men who arrived in the same condition, the blank stares, the uncontrollable twitching, the moments of inexplicable panic. It wasn't the wounds they had expected to see when the war had first arrived at their doorstep. This was something else entirely. It was not physical, but it was just as real, if not more so. Yet, it didn't seem to fit into the neatly organized world of medical diagnosis they had grown used to. There were no clear causes, no simple treatment methods. It didn't make sense in the rigid framework of traditional medicine, and so, like so many things that are difficult to understand, it was largely ignored. It was easier to dismiss the men who couldn't explain themselves, easier to focus on the visible injuries and send these cases away to be forgotten. But the problem was too big to stay hidden for long. Soon, the wards began to fill with soldiers who could not be healed by bandages or medicine. There was a growing tension in the air, one that was palpable as the soldiers grew more numerous and their suffering more evident. The doctors, once so sure of their authority, were starting to question their own understanding of the war's toll. These men, so young, so full of promise, were now shadows of themselves, lost to a darkness that no one had ever seen before, and the doctors, though compassionate and dedicated, were at a loss. How could they treat what they didn't understand? How could they begin to heal wounds they couldn't even see? The traditional methods of medicine were powerless in the face of something so intangible. It was as if the soldiers were trapped in their own minds, their bodies responding to pain in ways that defied the usual rules. Every attempt to soothe them seemed to fall short, and every new case felt like another failure to grasp the scope of the problem. The men weren't just physically broken, they were mentally shattered, pieces of their souls scattered to places where no one could follow. They weren't just injured, they were lost. The silence in the wards grew louder with each passing day. This was the beginning of the crisis, the slow realization that what had been dismissed as weakness was, in fact, something far more insidious. The men were not simply broken in spirit, they were suffering from a condition that the medical world didn't yet have the vocabulary to describe. The disbelief, the rejection, the confusion, these feelings only deepened the soldiers' sense of isolation. And yet, as the days passed, there was a growing recognition that this wasn't just an individual problem. This was a crisis that would require more than medical expertise. It would require an entire shift in thinking, an entire redefinition of what it meant to be a soldier and what it meant to return from war. But for now, the silence remained. The doctors, though initially uncertain, were beginning to see that this wasn't a simple matter of soldiers recovering from the horrors of battle. This was something deeper. This was not a physical wound, but a mental one that could not be treated with the tools they had at their disposal. The soldiers weren't simply suffering from the fear of war, they were trapped in a permanent state of distress, a state that could not be easily escaped. The very idea of shell shock was hard to comprehend for a medical world used to treating wounds that could be seen, touched, or measured. What were they supposed to do with soldiers whose wounds were invisible, whose pain was not something that could be diagnosed with a simple test or X-ray? And yet, as the number of soldiers suffering from the same symptoms grew, so too did the urgency for understanding. Something had to change. But what? The question lingered, unanswered, in the sterile halls of the hospitals as the soldiers lay in their beds, waiting for a diagnosis that may never come. It was a medical crisis, but also a moral one, and it was one that would take years to resolve. The trenches were not just a battleground. They were a hell of mud, blood, and relentless terror. Day after day, the soldiers were submerged in this nightmare, their lives nothing more than a delicate balance between survival and madness. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the constant odor of wet earth and rotting flesh seeping into their skin, their clothing, their very souls. The constant sound of artillery shells overhead was like the soundtrack of their lives, punctuated by the violent rattle of machine gun fire. The ground beneath them was a shifting, endless mire of mud, where each step was a struggle, each movement a risk. Soldiers sank into the muck, their boots sticking, making every action a slow and painful process. The cold, damp air gnawed at their bones, and the only warmth came from the fleeting moments of respite when they huddled together in makeshift shelters, trying to stay dry and sane. But the true horrors of the trenches were not just the physical conditions, it was the constant fear, the fear that death could come at any moment, from any direction. You could hear it before you saw it, the high-pitched whistle of an incoming shell, the low rumble of the earth shaking as it exploded nearby. You would hold your breath, waiting for the moment the blast hit, bracing for impact, for the searing pain, for the crushing weight of the earth falling in around you. And when the explosion finally came, it was often too late to even react. It was the fear of never knowing if you would make it through the next minute, the next hour, the next day. The air was filled with the screams of the wounded, the cries of comrades who were torn apart before their very eyes. There was no escape from the constant barrage, no escape from the fear that lingered just beneath the surface. It was a terror that seeped into your thoughts, your dreams, and your very existence. It wasn't just physical injury that these men faced, it was psychological torment that gnawed at them long after the war was over. For many of the soldiers, this constant exposure to violence and death led to the breakdown of their minds. The trenches were the birthplace of shell shock, the birthplace of a trauma that no one could yet understand. It was in those moments of unimaginable horror, when a fellow soldier was torn apart before your eyes, or when you felt the earth shift beneath you as if the world itself was ending, that the seeds of psychological injury were sown. Yet, there was no language for what they were experiencing. No one knew how to process the relentless terror, the isolation, or the overwhelming sense of hopelessness that pervaded every aspect of life in the trenches. The soldiers were expected to endure, to carry on, to be strong, But the longer they stayed in this environment, the more their minds began to crack under the pressure. What seemed like madness to the outside world was actually the natural consequence of living in a place where the human spirit could be pushed to its limits and beyond. And yet, back home, no one understood what the soldiers were going through. Their families and loved ones imagined a different war, one where their men were heroes, fighting for a cause greater than themselves, returning home with pride and strength. But what the soldiers brought back with them were not stories of victory, but of trauma, a trauma that was invisible to the naked eye. When the men returned from the front lines, they were not celebrated as heroes. They were looked upon with confusion and often pity. They had seen things no one could imagine, and their minds had been permanently scarred by it. But the world was not ready to face the true costs of war. Instead of sympathy, they received suspicion, misunderstanding, and a cold indifference that would follow them for the rest of their lives. In the early days, the medical community simply didn't know what to make of the soldiers who came home broken. These men, who had been to the depths of human suffering, were dismissed as weak, as fragile, as simply unable to handle the pressure of war. Shell shock, as it was first called, was seen not as a legitimate medical condition, but as a sign of moral or emotional failure. The doctors, themselves burdened by the overwhelming demands of wartime medicine, were quick to label the soldiers as mentally ill, as if their suffering could be explained away by simple terms like nervous breakdown or hysteria. They were told to pull themselves together, to stop being weak, to simply go back to normal life. The idea that their minds had been irrevocably damaged by the war was dismissed as far too complex, too difficult to understand. These men, whose souls had been fractured by the horrors of the battlefield, were seen as failures, as if their pain were something they could choose to overcome with willpower alone. Doctors struggled with this new and terrifying reality. They had never been trained to treat the mind in the way that was now necessary. The soldiers' symptoms were puzzling, a range of physical and emotional responses that didn't fit neatly into any known category. Some men were paralyzed, unable to move, their bodies seized by invisible forces. Others couldn't stop shaking, their hands trembling uncontrollably. Some were lost in a fog of confusion, unable to recognize their surroundings or remember their own names, and still others were consumed by terrifying hallucinations, reliving the horrors of the trenches over and over again. How could any of this be treated? There was no prescription, no medicine to calm the mind in the way that antibiotics could heal a wound. There was no quick fix. The soldiers were simply told that they needed to snap out of it, to return to the normal rhythm of life. They were told that what they were experiencing was not real, that they were just being weak, that they needed to pull themselves together and get back to their duty. But how could you return to normal after witnessing the unimaginable? How could you heal from wounds that no one could see, wounds that were too deep to even be acknowledged? The medical community's denial was not born from malice, but from a lack of understanding. The trauma of war had not yet been fully recognized as something that could permanently damage the human mind. The concept of psychological injury was still in its infancy, and the language to describe it simply did not exist. The doctors were caught between a desire to help and a deep-seated belief that the soldiers should be able to recover with time, but time alone would not heal their wounds. And so, the soldiers continued to suffer in silence, their pain dismissed as weakness, their trauma ignored as something too uncomfortable to confront. The gap between what these men had endured and the treatment they received could not have been wider, and as the years passed, it became clear that this denial would only make the suffering worse, as the soldiers were left to fight their battles alone, both in their minds and in the world outside. The hospital wards were filled with soldiers who no longer recognized the world around them. Their faces were distant, their eyes vacant, as though they had traveled far away from the rooms they occupied. These weren't the men who had once laughed and joked in the barracks. These were hollowed-out shells, their spirits dimmed by the invisible wounds they carried. The constant hum of the hospital, the clatter of trays, the rustling of nurses' uniforms seemed to reach them only faintly, like distant echoes. They sat in beds, stiff and unmoving, their bodies silent but their minds in turmoil. The air in the ward was thick with the weight of unspoken pain, the kind of suffering that had no name, no diagnosis, and most tragically, no understanding. In the midst of this, the doctors and nurses moved in a blur, trying to tend to the physical injuries that could be seen and touched. Yet, with every passing day, the soldiers who lay before them, battered, bruised, and scarred, felt more like strangers. The medical staff, exhausted from their own battles, had no answers. They knew how to treat a wound, how to bandage a broken limb, but they didn't know how to heal a mind shattered by the violence of war. The soldiers were caught in a limbo, not physically injured enough to be sent away, but not well enough to be allowed back into society. They were told to rest, to regain their strength, but there was no healing for the pain that churned beneath their skin. No amount of rest would silence the memories of explosions, screams, or the sight of a friend's body being torn apart. The feeling of isolation grew as each day passed in a blur of frustration and helplessness. The soldiers lay in their beds, surrounded by others who were also struggling, yet each man felt utterly alone in his suffering. There were no words for the terror they had endured, no way to explain the quiet madness that crept into their thoughts. It wasn't the kind of madness that screamed, it was the kind that slowly ate away at you, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but numbness. The ward was filled with silence, but it wasn't peaceful silence. It was a silence born of fear and hopelessness, a silence that hung heavy in the air, suffocating the men who lay there, waiting for something, anything, to make them feel whole again. Some soldiers cried out in their sleep, their dreams haunted by visions of the battlefield. Others sat upright in bed, staring at the walls, their faces expressionless, as if they had learned that nothing mattered anymore. The medical staff would enter, offer comfort, try to talk to them, but the words always felt empty. How could you comfort someone who had seen the very worst that humanity could do? How could you explain that they were not weak, that they had not failed? How could you offer solace when the very thing that caused their suffering was something that no one understood? The soldiers didn't need a bandage. They needed understanding. They needed someone to see them for who they were, not as broken men, but as men who had been pushed beyond their limits, who had endured more than any human should have to. Yet, all they received was silence, and it only deepened their pain. The problem didn't stop with just a few men. As time went on, the wards grew fuller. More soldiers arrived, each with their own story, their own trauma, yet each of them carrying the same invisible burden. It was clear that something was happening, something that no one had anticipated, something that could not be easily explained. But still, the medical community failed to grasp the extent of the problem. They continued to focus on the visible wounds, the amputations, the broken bones. The invisible wounds, the ones that dug into the minds of the soldiers, went largely ignored. Each new case felt like a whisper of a growing crisis, one that was too overwhelming to confront. But the numbers couldn't be denied. More and more soldiers arrived, their eyes vacant, their hands shaking, their spirits fractured, and yet no one knew what to do with them. No one knew how to treat the trauma that had been inflicted on their very souls. The soldiers were left to suffer in silence, their pain dismissed, their needs unmet. The growing number of cases was a stark reminder that this was not an isolated issue. This was something that could not be ignored forever. In the beginning, it seemed like a rare occurrence, a soldier who had been so deeply affected by the war that he could no longer function in the way society expected. But as more men arrived, the pattern became undeniable. It wasn't just a few men suffering from the horrors of war, it was hundreds, then thousands. Each one of them arrived with the same symptoms: a detachment from reality, an inability to feel safe, a sense of unending dread. Yet still, the medical community struggled to grasp what was happening. They had no answers, no treatments, just theories, and with each passing day, the number of men affected grew, the crisis expanding until it could no longer be ignored. But instead of seeing it for what it was, a mental wound as real as any physical injury, the soldiers were once again left to fend for themselves. The wards continued to fill, and the silence continued to grow, thick and suffocating. The suffering, though invisible, was more real than ever. But the question remained: who would see it? Who would understand it? And who would offer the soldiers the care they so desperately needed? The crisis was no longer just a series of isolated cases, it was a widespread epidemic, and still the world seemed unwilling to face it. It began with a whisper, a quiet, almost tentative suggestion that perhaps these men were not simply weak, as so many had assumed. The first doctors who dared to challenge the prevailing notion of shell shock as a moral failing were met with skepticism. They were outliers in a medical community more concerned with visible injuries than invisible wounds, but their voices, though soft, carried with them the weight of empathy. They began to look at the soldiers not as failures, but as victims of something far more complex, something that could not be ignored. These doctors were not many, but their courage sparked a glimmer of hope. They observed the men who had returned from the front lines, not just as casualties of war, but as individuals broken in ways that could not be seen by the naked eye. They saw that the trauma of war was not merely a physical injury, but a psychological wound that could not be healed by time alone. One of the earliest advocates for this new understanding was Dr. Charles Myers, a British physician who began to study the phenomenon of shell shock closely. He dared to put a name to the condition, calling it traumatic neurosis. His work, though controversial, marked the first step toward recognizing the true nature of the affliction. Dr. Myers began to challenge the prevailing assumptions, using empirical evidence to argue that the psychological trauma caused by the horrors of war was not only real, but it was also capable of causing lasting damage. This was a revelation for many, though it was met with considerable resistance. Some medical professionals refused to believe that the mind could be injured in such a way, arguing that it was just a matter of time before the soldiers returned to their old selves. But for those who had begun to understand, there was a quiet sense of victory in knowing that, at last, someone was listening. Other doctors followed in Dr. Myers's footsteps, building upon his theories and observations. They began to document cases more rigorously, gathering evidence to support their claims. But despite their growing body of work, they were still fighting an uphill battle. The medical community was slow to change, especially when it came to something as revolutionary as acknowledging the mental toll of war. These doctors were not just facing resistance from their colleagues, they were also facing an entrenched societal belief that real warriors did not break. To suggest otherwise was to challenge the very foundation of what it meant to be a soldier. Yet, as more and more men returned home with the same symptoms, the need for change became undeniable. Still, progress was slow, and many of these early pioneers struggled to gain widespread acceptance. The path to recognition was fraught with obstacles, but each small victory was a step forward in the long journey toward understanding. The emergence of these first few doctors was a turning point in the battle for recognition, but even as the medical community began to acknowledge the legitimacy of shell shock, the societal forces that had once dismissed it as weakness were not easily swayed. The men who had suffered in silence were not yet being given the care they needed, and the path to treatment remained unclear. However, for those who had begun to see the truth, the idea that these soldiers had been harmed in ways beyond their control was a light in a very dark place. It was the beginning of a long and difficult journey, one that would take decades to fully navigate. Yet for the first time there was a sense of momentum, a sense that progress was possible, even if it seemed far out of reach. But as with all progress, it was met with resistance. The very idea that the soldiers who had been sent to fight for their country could be anything other than brave and stoic was a threat to the narrative that had been so carefully constructed. War was meant to forge men, to shape them into heroes who could withstand any hardship. The suggestion that war could break something deeper, something invisible, was too uncomfortable for many to accept. And so, those who began to challenge the status quo were met with intense backlash. As the idea of shell shock began to gain traction, so too did the voices of those who were desperate to preserve the old view of war and soldiers. There were those who argued that shell shock was simply a result of cowardice, an excuse for soldiers who couldn't handle the reality of combat. These voices were not just medical professionals, they were part of a broader societal belief that men who had been to war should emerge stronger, not weaker. The pressure to conform to this idea was immense. Politicians, military leaders, and even some members of the public viewed the recognition of shell shock as an inconvenient truth, one that undermined the image of the war hero. The very notion that the brave soldiers who fought for their country could suffer mental trauma was seen as a threat to the narrative of national pride and sacrifice. The backlash was not just philosophical, it was practical too. Many doctors who spoke out were ostracized, their careers damaged by their willingness to challenge the prevailing views. The early pioneers of shell shock recognition found themselves fighting not only for the soldiers, but for their own professional survival. The medical community was slow to embrace the idea that mental health could be just as important as physical health, especially in the context of wartime. The stigma surrounding mental illness, compounded by the need to protect the image of war and heroism, made it incredibly difficult to gain widespread acceptance for shell shock as a legitimate medical condition. This societal resistance created an atmosphere of frustration and hopelessness for the soldiers who were caught in the middle. They were seen as victims of war, but they were also viewed as outliers, as anomalies in a system that had no place for weakness. For them, the road to recognition felt endless, as if their suffering was destined to remain invisible. As the medical community struggled to catch up, these men continued to suffer in silence, their trauma ignored by the very society that had sent them to war. The social and political resistance was not just a matter of dismissing their pain, it was an active effort to suppress the reality of what war could do to a person. The soldiers who had returned home broken were caught between the medical world, which didn't understand them, and the society that refused to see them. They had become the forgotten victims of war, their struggles denied by those who should have been helping them. And so, the battle for recognition continued, not just in the hospitals, but in the courtrooms, in the halls of government, and in the hearts and minds of those who had never been to war. It was a battle that would shape the future of mental health, one that would take years to win, but for those who had seen the truth, there was no going back. They knew that the soldiers' pain was not a weakness, it was a consequence of the unimaginable, and no matter how many forces stood in their way, they were determined to make the world understand. The soldiers who had returned from the war with broken minds were not the ones who were celebrated, they were the ones forgotten, dismissed as weak or damaged. In the years following the end of the war, many of these men found themselves adrift, lost in a world that had no place for their pain. They had fought for their country, but their country had failed them. There were no medals for the invisible wounds they carried, no recognition for the suffering that had left them hollowed out. Their minds, shattered by the horrors of war, were often left untreated, their trauma ignored by a society that didn't know how to care for it. These men were the walking wounded, their scars not visible to the naked eye, but deeply etched into the fabric of their lives. They struggled to reconnect with their families, their friends, and their communities. The pain that consumed them was not just psychological, it was deeply physical, manifesting in chronic illnesses, sleepless nights, and nervous breakdowns. They had been given no tools to cope, no understanding of what was happening to them. Instead, they were expected to return to civilian life, to be the men they had been before the war, as if the atrocities they had witnessed had never happened. But the truth was that the war had never left them. It lived in their nightmares, in the flashbacks that haunted them in the quiet moments of their lives. It lingered in their unease, in their inability to trust, in the overwhelming sense of dread that followed them wherever they went. For many, the trauma of war was like a shadow that loomed over everything they did, making even the simplest tasks feel like insurmountable obstacles. The relationships they tried to rebuild were strained by their emotional detachment, their inability to express what had happened to them. The world had moved on, but they had not. In the worst cases, the untreated trauma led to a slow unraveling of their lives. Some turned to alcohol or drugs to numb the pain, while others became isolated, cutting themselves off from society entirely. The inability to face what had happened to them, coupled with society's rejection of their suffering, created a perfect storm of self-destruction. The very men who had once been heroes now found themselves forgotten, lost in a sea of mental anguish with no shore in sight. Many of them never recovered. The lack of understanding, the lack of support, and the lack of treatment meant that the pain they carried was often with them until the end of their lives. It wasn't just their personal lives that were destroyed. The long-term effects of untreated shell shock rippled through their communities, their families, and the very fabric of society. The emotional and psychological scars left by the war were passed down to future generations as families struggled to cope with the aftermath of the soldiers' unhealed trauma. Children grew up in households where the effects of war lingered, where fathers were distant, withdrawn, or, worse, emotionally and physically abusive. The trauma of war, left untreated, created a cycle of pain and suffering that stretched across time, affecting not just the soldiers, but those who loved them as well. The cost of ignoring mental health, of failing to address the invisible wounds of war, was not just the destruction of individual lives, but the fracturing of entire families and communities. The pain that these men carried, unseen and often unacknowledged, left an indelible mark on history. It was a pain that stretched beyond the battlefield, beyond the war itself, and into the very soul of a society that failed to see the consequences of its actions. The soldiers' long-term struggles were the result of a failure to recognize the cost of war on the mind, and that failure would haunt them and the generations that followed for years to come. But over time, the experience of these soldiers would begin to change the way society viewed mental health. The suffering of war, though largely ignored in the years immediately following, began to spark a shift in how people understood trauma. It wasn't a smooth transition. For years, mental health remained a taboo subject, especially in the context of war. Soldiers were still seen as weak if they showed any signs of emotional distress, and the medical community was still grappling with how to treat psychological trauma. But the experience of these soldiers, and the growing number of veterans who came forward with similar stories, began to chip away at the long-standing stigma surrounding mental health. As the decades passed, a slow but steady shift in societal attitudes took place. The recognition of shell shock, later understood as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, marked the beginning of a new era in mental health care. Society began to see that mental illness was not a sign of weakness, but a legitimate medical condition that needed to be addressed. The experience of war, with all its brutality and violence, had shown the world the cost of ignoring the psychological toll it took on the human mind. And though it took years for the medical community to catch up, the seeds had been planted. Slowly, the idea that mental health was just as important as physical health began to gain traction. In the wake of the Vietnam War and the subsequent wars that followed, veterans who had been affected by combat trauma began to speak out, sharing their experiences and demanding better care. It was a long, difficult battle, but the lessons of history, of the soldiers who had been forgotten, of the lives destroyed by untreated trauma, began to shape the future. Today, mental health is no longer something to be ashamed of, no longer something to be hidden away. We have learned through the painful experiences of those who came before us that trauma is real, that mental wounds are as valid as physical ones, and that no one should have to suffer in silence. The recognition of shell shock was the first step in this journey, the beginning of a change in how we view the mind and its struggles. It was a long and painful road, but it was a road that led to greater understanding and, ultimately, to healing. The change in societal attitudes toward mental health was not just about recognizing the past, it was about shaping the future. It was about creating a world where people didn't have to suffer in silence, where mental health was treated with the same urgency and care as physical health. And while the scars of the past cannot be erased, the lessons learned from the soldiers' struggles have paved the way for a future where those who suffer from trauma are no longer forgotten. The journey toward understanding and compassion has been long, but it is one that continues, building on the foundation laid by those who fought, not just for their country, but for the recognition of the invisible wounds that left scars far deeper than any that could be seen. The echoes of shell shock still resonate today, though they no longer go by that name. What was once dismissed as weakness has evolved into a widely recognized condition, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. The experience of soldiers from the First World War, trapped in the silence of their suffering, has laid the foundation for how society understands the psychological toll of warfare. What began as an obscure medical mystery has transformed into a crucial area of study, guiding both our recognition of trauma and our approach to treatment. Yet, despite this progress, the scars left by war continue to run deep. Modern veterans returning from conflicts such as Iraq, Afghanistan, and other areas of intense combat now face the same invisible wounds that soldiers of the past struggled with. The symptoms may look different, but the underlying pain is the same. The flashbacks, the nightmares, the uncontrollable fear, the numbness, and the emotional withdrawal. For many, it can feel like the world has moved on, while they remain trapped in a past they cannot escape. Though medical professionals now have more tools to address PTSD and trauma, the road to healing remains long and often difficult. Veterans often find themselves navigating a complex system, one that has improved but is still fraught with barriers to proper care and understanding. Despite this, significant strides have been made. The language surrounding mental health has shifted, and PTSD is no longer hidden behind stigmas of shame. The courageous voices of those who spoke out about their suffering, like the shell-shocked soldiers of World War I, have led to broader societal recognition and acceptance of trauma as a real and valid condition. Yet, even with these advances, the battle is not over. Many veterans today still face the ongoing effects of trauma with little more than a fragile understanding of their experiences. They carry the burden of years of emotional pain, often in silence, and their lives can become a delicate balance between finding healing and managing the fallout of untreated mental health struggles. The war, for them, never really ends. It continues, echoing through their minds and hearts long after the combat has ceased. The most painful truth is that the legacy of shell shock endures not just in the experiences of those who fought, but in the lives of their families and communities. The ripple effects of untreated trauma can be devastating. Relationships falter, children grow up with fractured identities, and the emotional scars pass from one generation to the next. While medical science has made incredible progress in understanding and treating PTSD, the long-term consequences of war's mental wounds can still haunt entire families for decades. As much as society has changed its understanding, there is still much left to be done to ensure that veterans are not forgotten again. They fought for a world that promised them peace and security, but for many, peace is something they must still search for every day. Yet, in the midst of this, there is hope. The recognition of PTSD has led to a more compassionate understanding of mental health, and society has begun to address the needs of veterans with greater awareness. Veteran support programs, therapy, and outreach have provided lifelines for those who need it most, but the journey is far from over. For many, the recognition of their suffering is the first step toward healing, but that healing is a slow, ongoing process. The road to recovery is not linear, and for some, it will take a lifetime. But the progress made since the days of the First World War offers a glimmer of hope that the future may one day offer the peace and recognition these men and women deserve. Even as we look at the struggles veterans face today, it's important to remember that these struggles, while deeply painful, are not without meaning. They remind us that the trauma of war is something we must address, both for those who serve and for the society that sends them into conflict. By recognizing the mental toll of war, we can continue to create systems of support that allow veterans to find healing, not just for themselves, but for their families and communities as well. The suffering of the past has created a profound shift in how we view mental health, but it has also left us with a responsibility to care for those who gave so much and to ensure that the invisible wounds of war are never ignored again. The journey toward healing is one that extends far beyond the battlefield. It's a path that begins with understanding and extends through support, therapy, and a willingness to confront the deeply ingrained wounds that affect both the mind and the soul. For decades, the soldiers who returned from war, broken and misunderstood, were left without answers. But now, as the understanding of trauma continues to evolve, the road to healing has become clearer, even if the way forward is still long. The changing understanding of mental health, particularly in the context of war, has allowed for new approaches to treatment and recovery. Today, we are more likely to acknowledge that the scars of war are not just physical and that healing from psychological trauma requires a different kind of care. It requires patience, understanding, and a shift in how we view the human mind. The veterans of past wars, those who lived with the long-term effects of shell shock and PTSD, were the pioneers of this understanding. Their suffering, though often ignored, has paved the way for a better future, one where the wounds of war are not hidden in silence, but are addressed with compassion and care. The path to healing for many veterans involves a combination of therapy, peer support, and sometimes medication. While it can be difficult, and progress is often slow, the recognition that these mental wounds are real has opened doors to new possibilities. Veterans who once felt alone in their struggles now have the opportunity to connect with others who share their pain and to find solace in the understanding that they are not the only ones suffering. The stigma surrounding mental health has lessened significantly, making it easier for veterans to seek the help they need. However, the journey is far from complete. Healing is a process that takes time, and for many, it is an ongoing struggle. Yet, despite the difficulties, there is progress. For the first time in history, we are beginning to understand the true cost of war, not just in the bodies of the soldiers who fight, but in the minds that return home. While many veterans still carry the weight of their experiences, they now have more resources at their disposal, more people willing to listen, and a greater societal understanding of their pain. The road to healing is one that will continue to evolve, but the foundation has been laid. As we continue to improve our understanding of trauma, mental health, and the consequences of war, the hope is that fewer and fewer soldiers will have to endure the suffering that so many of the past have endured. The legacy of the silent soldiers is one that we must continue to honor, not just by remembering their sacrifice, but by ensuring that the invisible wounds of war are addressed with the same care and respect as the visible ones. In this way, their struggle becomes part of a larger narrative, a narrative that ultimately leads to a world where healing is possible and where no soldier is left to suffer alone.